I want to start with sending out a thank you and greeting Eileen Derick, my translator, who did a wonderful job in making this paper hopefully a fluent text. And also a thank you to the translators here in the room who have an amazing work here. Then, of course, and this is not just the usual thanks to the organizer. What came to my mind in the last 2 days was again that also discussing with Isabel that the art field is really a wonderful field for very different positions coming together from diverse social, geopolitical, theoretical backgrounds. But I think this conference is quite even using this advantage of the art field in a very special way, and I want to thank Maria and Fulia and all the people from Bach and SCORE for that. And my third thank you goes to Simon, who also had some homework for me. And for me it was a kind of step further in my tries to kind of put together classical aesthetics, you know, the German type 18th and 19th century aesthetics, contemporary political philosophy, and contemporary art practice. And this is what I'm going to try to do in this paper again, to mix those three fields or three perspectives. The horizon, in my view, and I'm just adding one more, not definition, but one more idea of the horizon to many others. I think that's also one positive aspect of the conference, that it's not kind of wanting to delineate the concept of horizon. So I'm adding one more, and this perspective is I think that has been said by Jesus already in the first day of the conference, that it's not just kind of from the perspective of a position which is totally attached to the subject position, but kind of thwarts also the logic of the individual and the collective on the one hand, and also maybe the opposition of reception and production aesthetics, or aesthetics of reception and production. So in my paper I'm gonna refer to or start with the founder of the aesthetics as philosophical discipline, and that will lead me to a very different position than Peter Osborne's lecture on the first day, because it's shifting the perspective towards also the term of horizon from the question of experience and, let's call it also reception, to a more production-oriented aspect. So I'm tending to say that we're not perceiving something as a horizon, but more producing horizons. And what I'm going to do in the paper is connect Baumgarten with the last lectures of Michel Foucault. You might have read it. It's been out for half a year, La Courage de la Vérité. And Michel Foucault's thinking about aesthetics of existence. First, a few words on the theoretical framework. What does former West mean here? A soft form of neoliberalism in the West, coupled with a Western neocolonialism in Eastern Europe. Whether or not this phase has ever really existed in anything like a pure form, it is over now. And in a way, I'm just repeating things that have been said, starting with the introduction of Maria 2 days ago. Theoretically, the phrase former West makes even less sense than it did to talk about the West before and around this fetish year, as Schuder called it, of 1989. In my view, the most intelligent perspective, and this is just a side remark of this, is the term Occidentalism, coined by Fernando Coronil and reframed in the German-speaking region by the feminist scholar Gabi Dietze as critical Occidentalism or Occidentalism critique, as a self-reflective marker for how hard it is for us to let go of our West, our Occident, even with a reference to the seemingly epochal break of 1989. The relationship between East and West, which in the 20th century was the tense relationship between different socialist projects and a hegemonic capitalist bloc, has given way in the 21st century to a confusing jumble of post-colonial and translocal exchange relationships. These are extremely complex, heterogeneous, and disparate, not at all synchronized, and they are also relatively unpredictable in their macro-political developments. If you take this place, this concrete place of the conference, and kind of see the sector of education as an example, who knows, for instance, where the franchise enterprises of major US American universities in China or India will lead? To new kinds of resistance in the classic Chinese and Indian colleges, or simply to a successful business model and an offshore opportunity for New York University or University of Washington and similar enterprises in the sector of education, to a homogenization of all universities, including those of the Global South, following the grim models like in Europe, the Bologna model, or a tremendous transformation of university institutions with a recursive negative impact on the European educational landscape. What is clear in any case is that whether or not a soft neoliberalism ever existed, that time has passed now. But what does this mean for the micropolitics and modes of subjectivation? The other side of, for instance, the macro-political perspective that Jody Dean was kind of presenting yesterday. What does that mean for all the various remnants, revivals and reinventions of deviant or dissident life forms, self-organized modes of existence and resistive niches in all different social strata? Censorship, repression and state violence are signs now that we increasingly have to deal with a modulating amalgam of repressive government and self-government. In the European Union member states, state racism measures against Roma and Sinti, the Islamophobe campaigns against minarets and burqas, but also the increase in state raids on anarchist animal rights activists or ecology activists are signs of this transformation. Yet, it would be too simple, however, to assume that the phase of soft neoliberalism and self-government is followed now by a linear development towards repression or even a return to a merely modified form of social subjugation. Rather, there is a complex and modulating increase of both, an increase of self-government and an increase of social subjugation in ever new forms. Yet specifically, this double increase must also prompt us to seek forms of resistance and molecular revolution in the cracks, ruptures and folds of governmentality. Against this backdrop, when I focus on an activist artistic practice from Russia, then it is not as a gesture of integrating it into a pseudo-universal figure of European activism, and certainly not at all as a symptom of the return of the wild East. At the first Former West conference, David Riff interpreted the aggressive actionist art practices in Russia in the 1990s, practices of artists like Alexander Brenner, Oleg Kulik, or Anatoly Oslomovsky, as mirroring the violence of primitive accumulation in these years. In contrast to this, the practice that I want to consider here at the start of my reflections which go further than with Baumgarten and Foucault, is not to be understood as mirroring, but rather as an exemplary instituent practice. It is exemplary in the heterogeneous and disparate geopolitical power and exchange relations, but also exemplary for the development of a new paradigm of artistic activism and the radical political imagination of the last decade. Stodelat, or What is to be Done, was founded in 2003, and David Riff, whom I just quoted, is a member of this group, as is Dimitri Vilensky, who will also speak today. So this is also a try to make a kind of trajectory to the discussions later this evening. Dimitri will hopefully talk more about the group's specific artistic philosophical activism. I just want to mention here three aspects which I see as conjoining the practice of Stodelat with what Michel Foucault discussed in his last lectures as parousia and the aesthetics of existence. First of all, there is the group's collectivity. Stodelat works as a collective assemblage. In the radically individualistic setting of the contemporary art field, this is not a simple thing. As a group, however, Stodelat are not an existentialist troupe of artists individualists, nor are they a network of opportunists, but rather a transversal assemblage of artists from all disciplines, philosophers, social researchers, and activists. There is something like an inner core of about a dozen people in Moscow and Petersburg, but it radiates to broader circles. As an instituent practice, Stodelat institutes experiments in organizing that, partly in the tradition of the Soviets and the worker councils, go beyond the core of the group. Most of all, their central organ, the journal Stodelat, has a discursive force of attraction, the contents and also the distribution of which make all simple references to East and West look hollow. Concretely, this also means that, for example, Latin American activist art practices from the 60s up to the present are probably more interesting points of contact for Stodelat than the classic Western European ones. I would like to call this socially fraying phenomenon an aesthetic horizon, and I will discuss this concept in more detail. Secondly, I need some water. Now it's break. Secondly, there is the Marxist appellation, which is already found in the name of the group. Of course, I learned that the first Russian author to write What is to be Done was not Lenin, but rather Chernyshevsky, and yet What is to be Done remains a recurrent allusion to Marx as well. And one of the activities of the group is to read Marx again, to rediscover Marx and throw back the covers of dogmatic Marxist-Leninist language. At the same time, of course, the Stalinist Soviet apparatus is just as little involved here as the wild Russian soul in the case of the actionists of the 1990s. The neo-Marxist reference to socialist practices and those of the Soviets is only to be understood in relation to translocal or globalized anti-globalization and the contemporary theories arising around it. An essential activity of the group, therefore, consists in the extremely difficult work of translating, in the broadest sense, between Marxist, neo-Marxist, and post-structuralist practices and theories. From the literal meaning of translation as a translation of forgotten Soviet texts and art practices into other languages, and a translation of contemporary practical philosophy into Russian and into Russian contexts, to social translation between different fields, primarily the art field and the political field, and to concrete exchange with significant theory figures outside the realm of the import-export business of the art field. I think that this multifold translation process develops a rare potentiality, particularly thwarting simple identifications of East and West. And thirdly, I would like to mention, without dramatizing it at all. The difficulties that beset Stodelat's everyday production and the extent, especially in Russia, partly structurally conditioned, partly consciously formed, to which it is a practice of parousia, of dangerous truth-speaking. With all their success abroad, the members of Stodelat still insist on their local impact. The newspaper was confiscated in Petersburg, the editors have been interrogated several times, and there is something like an unspoken employment ban, at least for the artists from Stodelat. In Russia, there are no exhibitions of the group, which, in their words, had to withdraw from the beginning from art territory and remain active in the other fields, mostly realizing and representing their works in a framework of different activist groups, civil society, NGOs, social forums, university, and the internet. But also on the level of their art practice or their specific representations, they kind of perform a certain practice of parousia. They kind of still pursue a multifold parousiastic practice of militancy, for instance in their recent work, the Tower Songspiel. The third and last part of the Songspiel trilogy in the tradition of Bert Brecht. It is an attack, on the one hand, an attack on Gazprom's politics of subjugation. The real story describes the plan of building a 403-meter-high Gazprom skyscraper against all regulations and counter to the will of the population of St. Petersburg. The powerful Gazprom industrialists, with the backing of Russian political leaders and in association with art, politics and religion, are attacked here in the Songspiel as representing political corruption, embodying the corruption of New Russia. This might depict the increase of social subjugation and repression in an allegedly democratic society. But, and this is more important from my point of view, at the same time, and wholly in keeping with this double increase of subjugation and self-government, below the podium in the Songspiel, the multiply fissured landscape of civil society in Petersburg does not appear in a positive light either. Here, self-government means total fragmentation, not only in the sense of individualization, but also of society breaking down into smaller and larger special interest groups, conflicting and caught in the web that they themselves help to weave, and that will ultimately strangle them. You can look up the video on the website of Stodelat. And now, as I promised, I'm going to develop what I understand with the term aesthetic horizon and go back 260 years. In 1750, Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten published the first part of his Aesthetica and thus founded the philosophical discipline of aesthetics. Even in the first sentence of his unfinished two-volume book or work, Baumgarten already describes aesthetics as ars pulchre cogitandi, an art of thinking beautifully. So from the start, aesthetics has not been solely a matter of the theory of sensuous cognition and the philosophical classification of the perception of the beautiful, but also of the problem of a different way of thinking. The art of thinking beautifully is not simply aestheticism, a mannerism of the philosopher, nor how one thinks and talks about beauty. Rather, it is a technique, a skill, an art to think beautifully in the sense that it is a completely different manner of thinking. To think beautifully, this autonomous quality of an inferior thinking evades logic, the superior cognitive capacity. And at the same time, it accompanies it, and in a sense even precedes it, as its dark, obscure, confused side. The thinking that is meant here is not simply beautiful, but rather it arises in a beautiful way. Aesthetics as the art of thinking beautifully means more than beautiful thinking or thinking about beauty. It attempts to open up thinking and to newly imagine and reinvent it. The power of invention, the power of imagination, this is a recurring resonance here with the subtitle of the conference, Art and Political Imagination. And also it is an allusion to a title of an article by Marcelo Exposito, Art as Radical Political Imagination, from 2005. This was the introduction to the volume 5 of the Spanish art magazine Brumaria from 2005, as I said. And I'm hinting at that because it's also maybe necessary to think about these ideas or this term that the organizers used as subtitle, political art as political imagination, or even radical political imagination, and connect it up to the very lively last decade of artistic activism. And I'm really stressing that also because there was this short remark of Shuda yesterday in the discussion, and I really have very similar theoretical backgrounds as Shuda, but in this case I have to say that it was too short saying that activist art is just about politics. That's an old, very reduced paradigm that also great philosophers like Jacques Rancière are unfortunately falling into this trap. It's this paradigm saying there are two problems. On the one hand, the problems of an autonomous art, and on the other hand, the problem of a political art, and there is something like a third way in between, which is the right one. And I think this is wrong in a certain sense, because it's necessary to differentiate, let's say, 1,000 of versions of the political in very different artistic practices, and not excluding anything out of that. And of course, artistic art practices developed specific competencies that go beyond this aspect of speaking about politics. Maybe we can discuss this in the discussion and further. So when I'm focusing in a rather close interpretation of Baumgarten on the expansion of cognition, this expansion also grows into radical political imagination to the extent that it means creating worlds, shifting, extending, inventing new horizons. It is the zones of dark and confused cognition that are the starting points and planes of friction for Baumgarten's position. With apparent devotion, the inventor of aesthetics approaches the hierarchical pattern of the Leibnizian ladder of cognition. Baumgarten here recognizes this hierarchy on the one hand, and then immediately undermines it. This is in a way the kind of also thwarting the idea of hierarchical ladder of cognition starting from some chaotic, confused realm, developing further and further into enlightenment. And Baumgarten does so by introducing a philosophical concept that he derives from the canon of epistemology and then removes far from its contemporary use. This concept is that of the horizon. As early as paragraph 6 in the preliminary remarks in his Aesthetics, Baumgarten notes one of the possible objections to the acceptance of aesthetics as a distinct plane of cognition. He writes, "One objection against our science may be that the senses, imaginations, fairy tales, the confusion of the passions, etc., are deemed to be unworthy of philosophers and below their horizon." But what does this infrahorizontem, below the horizon of the philosophers, mean? Obviously, there are lower, dark things that are not only unworthy of the perspective of the philosopher, but also threaten to elude this perspective. To begin with, Baumgarten responds to the objection against this new sphere of cognition as follows. A philosopher is a man among men, And it is not good for him to believe that such a large portion of human cognition is inappropriate for him. End of quote. Baumgarten's lecture transcript presents in the same place the ironic image of the philosopher as a rock rising up high above the clouds, elevated above all that is sensual. What lies below the clouds, below the horizon, however, is not worthy of his sublime notice. Yet at the same time he does not even see it. This blind spot of the philosophers, as specialists of reason, is a first indication of Baumgarten's special interest in what is dark, confused, and of his subversive strategy towards the Leibnizian hierarchy of cognition. Baumgarten continues to use the concept of higher cognition for reason and that of lower cognition for sensuous cognition. Implicitly, however, this hierarchy tips in his argumentation. The vertical order becomes a horizontal order. And this is unambiguously expressed in Baumgarten's use of the concept of the horizon. For Baumgarten, the horizon is no longer just a line, a homogeneous boundary of human cognition or a boundary between forms of cognition, but rather it is a sphere, a sphera. For this reason, in Baumgarten's terminology, there is not only an above and a below the horizon, but also and especially the question of what is within the horizon. Although this kind of spatialized notion of the horizon could already be found in Leibniz and maybe even before in the scholastic philosophy, Baumgarten goes further. At the beginning of the section of the abundance of matter, Baumgarten introduces a folding of the horizon concept, a spatial social division into the territory, the sphere of a horizon logicus, a logical horizon, and the territory, the sphere of a horizon aestheticus, the aesthetic horizon. Both of these horizons are no longer to be regarded as an absolute boundary of cognition, but rather as two mutually tangential, even overlapping spatial social spheres. For their part, the two spheres are arranged horizontally and they are not total, they do not cover everything. There are materials that lie infra horizontem aestheticum, and there are some that are super horizontem aestheticum, but there are also some that are common to both horizons. The horizon is thus no longer a boundary, the end, finis, that which delimits our view or our cognition, an absolute and insurmountable boundary of immanence, yet it is also not a transcendental or even utopian echo of that which is on the other side of the boundary, a sign of what eludes our view. And finally, the horizon is also not a border space of two realms overlapping at their ends, no confinium, as the place where, in scholastic philosophy, the human soul or the human being is situated between nature and knowledge. For Baumgarten, the horizon itself is something in which one moves as in a sphere. A particular sphere, however, which still goes beyond knowledge and nature. No longer simply the inferior sphere of lower cognition, the aesthetic horizon is able to influence the logical horizon. The task of the aesthetic sphere is to expand the logical horizon into what is dark, and this expansion is a never-ending process. As an aesthetic horizon, the horizon itself becomes a heterocosmos, a completely immanent and yet different world. This term of the heterocosmos is the link between Baumgarten and Foucault. As the introduction of a new concept, the concept of heterocosmos is found across and at the same time alongside broad sections of Baumgarten's reflections on questions of aesthetic truth and falseness, of aesthetic probability and poetic fictions. Heterocosmos, the different world, as a reality created in addition to the actual world. Yet instead of being described as a hereafter, something beyond, in Baumgarten's aesthetic theory, the heterocosmos becomes a cipher for the assertion that another world is not only possible, but is already created in the here and now. Heterocosmoses are not simply otherworldly, artistic representations in contrast to a real world, The aesthetic truth of the heterocosmos is an immanent truth in its own right, which is only limited by the question of poetic probability. As long as the other world and its components are created as a coherent assemblage in terms of both content and form, they are entitled to exist alongside the real world. Beyond this, however, it is primarily the constant movement which exists between this world and the other world that predominates in Baumgarten's reflections on the admissibility of artistic inventions. For this reason, within the framework of his explanations of poetic striving for truth, he discusses the back and forth between dream and reality, between aestheticological truth and truth in the narrower sense, between heterocosmos and the real world. Here Baumgarten especially emphasizes the shock we experience when we are confronted, once we have stepped into the heterocosmic sphere, with something that is strictly true from this, the real world. Though he insists at this point that poetic probability can persist in maintaining its different world autonomously until the end, it is here that the possibility of the juxtaposition of multiple worlds becomes clear. How we are torn between them, but also that these multiple worlds are interconnected. Yet how is the aesthetic horizon as a sphere of the art of thinking beautifully? How is the aesthetic horizon as a sphere of a different thinking connected with the different world, the heterocosmos? I think this question can be best explained with Foucault's reflections in La Courage de la Vérité. I think the book is not translated in English yet, but it will come out like in next year. But anyway, I think it's a very an eye-opener for diverse Foucaultian Foucaultological aspects. Foucault devoted his last lecture once again to the question of truth-speaking, parousia, and specifically its most radical form, Kinnic philosophy, and I'm using the K for Kinnic. I don't know if that's the English correct English pronunciation, to have a difference to cynicism or to cynical in the everyday language. So I'm saying Kinnic philosophy. Is that okay in English too? On 14th March of 1984, 2 weeks before the end of his last lecture, in the middle of his interpretation of Kinnicism as philosophical activism, as an exaggeration of true life to a scandalous, different life, Foucault made a statement that directly applies to our question. He said, "Kinnicism did not assert this differentness of a different life merely as a choice of a different, happier, more sovereign life, but rather as a practice of militancy in the horizon of which there is a different world." End of quote. A practice in the horizon of which, within the horizon of which, there is a different world. This is exactly the model that we are already familiar with from Baumgarten. The horizon is not a line, not an absolute boundary, not a line of demarcation, but rather a sphere, a practice, within which a different world, a heterocosmos, occurs. And Foucault continues on the cynic way of living, quote, "So you see that the Kinnic is the one who takes up the traditional themes again of true life in the philosophy of antiquity, at the same time transposing these themes and inverting them into a demand for and assertion of the necessity of a different life. And then he transposes again, on the basis of the image and the figure of the pitiful king, the idea of a different life into the theme of a life whose differentness should lead to changing the world. A different life for a different world." End of quote. Many find Foucault's turn to the lifestyles of antiquity in the last years of his life politically incomprehensible. Yet Foucault clearly explains in his lecture the potential actualization of these ways of living. He sees a genealogy of parousia and cynicism, which was actualized in the Middle Ages in the Minoritarian heretical movements, which reappears in modernity, particularly since the 18th and 19th century, in the major revolutionary movements. When he consequently takes this genealogy for our times into art, as the third carrier of cynicism, of lifestyle, as the scandal of truth, his writings and lectures involve only, and this is a quote, sketchy remarks, notes, possible works. With this background of the sketchiness associated with an aesthetics of existence, movements come into view which consider life as the object as aesthetic endeavor, treatment and perception, the bios as beautiful work. At the same time, an ambiguity must be kept in mind, even if it cannot be completely resolved. The Foucaultian terminology of the aesthetics of existence is difficult, especially in the apparent resonance of an undertone of pathos. Foucault's allusions in reference to art, especially those about the significance of the life of the artist in the 19th century, could also be understood in the line of radical individualism, dandyism, and existentialism. However, even though dandyism and existentialism certainly also belong to the genealogy of the aesthetics of existence, in the present, aesthetics of existence does not at all indicate an individualistic aestheticization or stylization of existence. On this, Foucault explicitly writes, quote, "If the analysis of cynicism is centered around this theme of individualism, there is a danger of losing sight of what is, in my view, one of its fundamental dimensions, the problem that is central to cynicism of interrelating forms of life and the manifestation of truth." End of quote. Forming life in its relationship to parousia, to dangerous truth-speaking, this is a central formula of Foucault's later writing. Positing relations between various singularities is substantially more important here than emphasizing an individualist dropout choice. From this, a certain Foucaultian interpretation of upheaval and revolution can be concluded. The general notion of revolution, and also in Foucault's genealogy of cynicism for a certain historical moment, namely the 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, is that it means, most of all, a political project. But what if revolution is understood not only as a political project, but also as a molecular revolution, as a reordering of ways, of forms of life? Then the aesthetics of existence again comes to the fore, or at least presents itself next to the political project as a, quote, constant and constantly renewed forming of life and living together. Forming the self, in the sense of a not only neoliberal form of self-government, in the sense of care for the self and care for others, means now and today primarily positing relations, not just an individual artist existence. A different thinking, a different life, a different world. Baumgarten's aesthetic horizon, to which a heterocosmos inheres, is also from the perspective of Foucault's aesthetic of existence, something that thwarts the dichotomy of individual and collective. In this way, the horizon becomes a specific instituent practice, a situative and local singularity, which also goes beyond its own boundaries, at the same time into ever new forms of transversality and translocality. And this is also coming back to the artistic activist practices of Stodellert and many others. I see them as an aesthetic horizon, and also with this double thwarting of, on the one hand, individual and collective, and on the other hand, local and translocal. The parousia of Stodellert and others occurs simultaneously as individual and collective, as local and translocal. This is what makes it an exemplary instituent practice, a practice of a militancy in the horizon of which there is a different world. Thank you.